This was a moment I'll never forget. I stared at the book in my hands, feeling a flicker of guilt. Was this really worth my time? It wasn't smart, it wasn't challenging, no one would call it serious literature. In fact, it wasn't even meant for someone my age. But I opened it anyway, and for the first time in a long time, I read just for me, and it was the best. And that's when I realized, so much about what we're told about reading is just wrong. The rules, the guilt, the expectations, they're not real. So today I'm breaking them down. Here are 10 lies you were told about reading, and why it's time to let them go. Lie number 1, you must finish every book you start. I used to force myself through books I wasn't enjoying. Pages dragging, eyes glazing over, counting how many were left instead of actually reading. I felt like quitting a book was just a failure, as if I owed it to the author or my past self who had picked it up in the first place. Then one day I asked myself, why? Who was I proving something to? No one's giving out gold stars for struggling through a book you hate. And the worst part, every minute I spent forcing myself through a book I wasn't enjoying was time I could have spent reading something I loved. The moment I gave myself permission to DNF, which means did not finish, reading became fun again. I started asking, am I enjoying this book? Am I excited to pick it up? If the answer was no, I let it go. And honestly, I've never looked back. Need more convincing? I have a whole video about DNFing books. I'll leave a link to that in the description. Lie number 2, reading faster means you're a better reader. I remember watching someone on social media claim they read 100 books in a year and I panicked. I wasn't reading fast enough. Did that mean I wasn't really a reader? So I started trying to read faster. I skimmed, I skipped over descriptions, I pushed myself to hit a page count goal every single day. But you know what? I barely remembered those books. I was consuming, but I wasn't connecting. Then I thought about the books I had read that year. The ones that I'd lingered over, annotated, reread passages from, the ones I'd lived inside for days. And I realized reading isn't a race, speed doesn't equal depth. Taking your time can be just as valuable as flying through the pages. Lie number 3. Audiobooks don't count as reading. I once told someone I read a book and they asked, oh, did you actually read it? Or did you just listen to the audiobook? Like my ears were cheating somehow. But here's the thing, your brain doesn't care whether your words enter through your eyes or your ears. Studies have shown that listening to a book engages the same cognitive processes as traditional reading. And honestly, in some ways, audiobooks let stories sink in even deeper. Hearing the emotion in a narrator's voice, the rhythm of the words, it's a different experience, but just as valid. Some of the best books I've read were ones I listened to while walking, traveling, or cooking, and guess what? I still cried at the sad parts, I still fell in love with the characters. So yes, audiobooks count as reading, end of story. Lie number 4, you should only read smart books. I used to feel embarrassed about picking up a light-hearted fantasy or a romance of some kind, as if I should be reading something important instead. Like if a book wasn't literary, difficult, or a classic, it didn't count. But books aren't vegetables. You don't have to read something just because it's good for you. Stories exist to entertain, to make you feel, to give you an escape. And honestly, some of the most serious books I've ever read were hidden inside fantasy, romance, and middle grade stories. If a book makes you happy, that's reason enough. Lie number 5, rereading books is a waste of time. I used to think rereading was a waste. Why go back when there are so many books out there? But then I picked up an old favorite just for fun and it hit completely differently. The story was the same, but I wasn't. I noticed things I'd missed, connected with different characters, and somehow it meant more this time around. And honestly, if we can rewatch our favorite movies or replay favorite songs, why shouldn't we reread the books that make us happy too? Lie number 6, annotations and writing in books ruin them. I used to treat my books like they were sacred. No creased spines, no bent corners, and definitely no writing in them. It felt like ruining something that was supposed to stay perfect. But then I joined Instagram and I saw pages of people's books covered in notes, underlines, little doodles in the margins, and they weren't ruined at all. They were beautiful. Books are meant to be lived in. Scribbling a thought in the margin, underlining a sentence that hits hard, it turns a book into a snapshot of who you were when you were reading it. And the best part, when you pick it up years later, you get to see what mattered most to you at that time. You get to see what made you pause, what left a mark. Lie number 7, if you don't remember every detail, you didn't really read it. Ever finished a book, loved it, and then 2 weeks later realized you couldn't remember half of the character names? Same. And for the longest time, I thought that meant that I hadn't really read it, like I'd done something wrong because I couldn't recall every plot twist on demand. But then I heard this. You don't remember the ingredients of every delicious meal you've ever eaten, but you remember how tasty they were and how they made you feel while you were eating them. Books work the same way. You don't have to memorize every detail for a story to leave its mark. Some books stick with you in unexpected ways, like a feeling, a single line, the way it made you see something differently. And honestly, even if all you remember is that you enjoyed it, that's enough. Line number 8. You have to read every day to be a real reader. I went through a whole month without picking up a book once, and at some point I caught myself thinking, am I even a reader anymore? Like I'd lost the right to call myself one just because life got busy or I wasn't in the mood to read. But here's the thing, reading isn't a job. There's no attendance sheet, no quota you have to hit. You don't get fired from being a reader just because you took a break. Books will always be there, waiting for you when you're ready. Some months you'll read 5 books, some months you'll read none, and both are completely fine. Line number 9. Some books are too easy for adults to read. I used to feel weird picking up middle grade or young adult books as an adult, like I needed some kind of excuse. Like, oh, I'm just checking it out for my niece, as if I had to justify why I was reading something meant for kids. But then I stopped to think, why does it matter? A beautifully written story is a beautifully written story, no matter who it was marketed to. Some of the most emotional, thought-provoking, memorable books I've ever read were ones technically meant for younger readers. The best books don't have an age limit. If a story speaks to you, it's for you. Line number 10. Graphic novels and manga aren't real books. I remember reading online that graphic novels don't count as reading, it's just pictures. Like the presence of artwork somehow made the story less valid. But if that were true, then film wouldn't be storytelling and art wouldn't be meaningful. Graphic novels and manga require just as much creativity, depth, and skill as any novel. Sometimes even more because they blend visuals and text to create something completely unique. Some of the most powerful, emotionally gripping stories I've ever read didn't have or had very little actual writing. And if a book can make you feel something, make you think, transport you to another world, then guess what? It counts. If you love stories, you're a reader. No rules, no guilt, just books that make you happy. So, what's the biggest reading lie you've had to unlearn? Thank you so much for watching, and I'll catch you next time for another video.